we are looking at Rolla Barth's essay, The Death of the Author. And Barth says that as soon as something is narrated, the author dies, metaphorically, because the narration or the writing is beyond the control of the author. And he refers to primitive societies and gives us the example of a shaman or a priest who narrates something, but that is more like a performance. He believes that the spirit enters him, and the purpose of this example is to indicate that historically author as an individual, this concept was not there, because the concept was that any knowledge that we have, all knowledge came from God or from some spirit, and human beings were only mediators of that knowledge. But as we were discussing in the last class, that with Romanticism in the 19th century, a number of factors, social, economic, cultural factors led to the discovery, and not only the discovery but the assertion of the human individual. And this assertion of the human individual as a persona, whether in politics or anywhere else, in the domain of literature, that came to be represented by the figure of the author. Later, Michel Foucault writes an essay called What is an Author, in which he borrows largely from this essay. Borrows in the sense that he builds his argument on the basis of Barth's work, The Death of the Author. So he discusses how author does not mean an individual, but it means actually a function, and it is more appropriate to speak of the author function. And before Barth, we have seen that Jean-Paul Sartre has asserted how readers are collaborators in the act of writing. There is a major difference between speech and writing, as I also told you in the last class, that speech suggests metaphysical presence of the author or the of a person, but writing does not suggest any presence. So writing is like a code, and it is there to be deciphered. And structuralism uses this concept of code, which Barth uses in this essay also, but this essay is not a structuralist essay. It is a later development, more postmodernist point of view than a structuralist one. But in his essays on narratology, on discourse analysis, Barth has used the concept of code as used in structuralism, particularly his essay or his book SZ, which is a structuralist analysis of Balzac's novella Sarrazin. S stands for Sarrazin, Z stands for Zambinella, and I have already told you the story of Sarrazin and Zambinella, which in this essay also Barth refers to. So the concept of genius is a later development. The author is a modern figure. It is not actually a later development. The word genius was there from the very beginning of times among Greeks and Romans, and in the Renaissance also. But genius ordinarily meant kind of guiding angel or spirit. You have the use of the word genius in that sense in Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra, where Antony says that Caesar's genius rebukes his own genius. So the guardian angel of Caesar rebukes the guardian angel of Antony, who is afraid of his guardian angel. All right. So that was the original meaning of genius. Well, 19th century gave it a new meaning, suggesting that it is individual genius. T.S. Eliot, of course, steered his course clear by writing the essay "Tradition and Individual Talent" and not individual genius. All right, so that you do not confuse his discussion of talent with the contaminated discussion of genius in the 19th century romantic discourse. The author is a modern figure, a product of our society insofar as emerging from the Middle Ages with English empiricism, French rationalism and the personal faith of the Reformation, it discovered the prestige of the individual, of, as it is more nobly put, the human person. French rationalism, coming down from René Descartes and others, the tradition that continues in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, English empiricism, Locke, Hume, belonging to the Enlightenment tradition, personal faith of the Reformation. The Reformation movement upheld the right of the individual person in spiritual matters to have direct communication with God. As you all know that Roman Catholicism believes that priests have a major role in individuals' well-being, spiritual well-being, but Protestants, they suggested that there should be no intermediary between an individual and God in the spiritual matters. So Barth does not say it, even though he had originally Marxist sympathies, but he is a much more sophisticated writer. He assimilates all Marxist ideas but never writes anything openly as a Marxist. He is not a Marxist, but his sympathies were with Marxism, with left liberalism, and he does not mention it that it is the concept of bourgeois individualism that was a consequence of the development of capitalism and industrial revolution. That the bourgeois individual was regarded as a unit in political, economic, social, all domains. So the unit was an individual for the first time, because previously nobody thought of an individual being a social unit. People thought of families, head of families, and so on. It is thus logical that in literature it should be this positivism, the epitome and culmination of capitalist ideology. Well, he speaks of it, the capitalist ideology. So he, of course, is not very far from this idea. He is thinking about it, even though he is not speaking like a Marxist. The positivism, that is that philosophy which believes that anything which cannot be proved logically and mathematically is wrong. So that is positivism. So positivism is a kind of philosophical blindness which is also a modern scientific superstition. And this positivism is the result of the bourgeois development, capitalistic development, and the rise of the individual. The author still reigns in histories of literature, biographies of writers, interviews, magazines, as in the very consciousness of men of letters, anxious to unite their person and their work through diaries and memoirs. So, men of letters originally wrote autobiographies, diaries and memoirs, thinking themselves to be men of importance. Even when they would write personal letters like think of Rabindranath. Rabindranath, of course, learned these things from the West. So, being a bourgeois writer, so even when he would write a personal letter, he would take every care that in future this letter might be published. All right. So that is what he learned from Gautier and other French writers who had their correspondence published. But that was once upon a time when men of letters considered themselves to be important enough to write autobiographies and memoirs, diaries and so on. But today, not men of letters, but celebrities, they write their memoirs. So today we have a new, commodity in the block called celebrity. Right. So what is a celebrity? Well, you ask, I'll not say this because I'm recording. So you ask the newspapers who make and break celebrities, what is a celebrity? So a celebrity is not necessarily a man of letters. That you understand well enough. The author still reigns in histories of literature. So fortunately, until recently we have been teaching histories of literature, where individual writers, poets, authors, they are given a lot of importance rather than the literary cultural movements, biographies. So there are certain genres still present where the author is still celebrated. Now, you may think of these genres as being very outdated. The image of literature to be found in ordinary culture is tyrannically centered on the author, his person, his life, his tastes, his passions, while criticism still consists for the most part in saying that Baudelaire's work is the failure of Baudelaire the man, Van Gogh's his madness, Tchaikovsky's his vice. So the typical traditional cultural history, literary history or analysis, criticism would refer to the man behind the work. So and would try to find reasons why a writer fails or succeeds in his work by looking at his life, by looking at his biography. The explanation of the work is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, as if it were always in the end, through the more or less transparent allegory of the fiction, the voice of a single person, the author, confiding in us. So we have seen that in 18th century novels, with the rise of the novels, with the rise of fiction, we have seen that the original attempt was to present fiction as truth, and as if the writer has some personal experience which he or she is conveying to the reader. So you may imagine that this was a trope that writers used from the beginning in modern times. Though the sway of the author remains powerful, the new criticism has often done no more than consolidate it. So Barthes, who was himself a part of new criticism, does not spare it either, and says that new criticism did not help in demolishing the idea of the author. On the contrary, consolidated it, which is criticism of critics who pay more attention to the author and establish the author as the origin of any work. It goes without saying that certain writers have long since attempted to loosen it. So the attempt of loosening the hold of the author on his text started earlier, and Barthes gives the example of the French poet Mallarmé, Stéphane Mallarmé, who had famously told a reader who asked him what was the meaning of a particular poem, and he told the reader that it has the meaning which you will give it the same. The meaning will be given by you. Whatever meaning you give it, that is its meaning. So Mallarmé was the first poet to think that the reader has a lot more important role to play in creating the meaning of a text. Mallarmé was doubtless the first to see and to foresee in its full extent the necessity to substitute language itself for the person who until then had been supposed to be its owner. Substitute language for the person who is the owner of the language. That is, in place of author, the language should be substituted. So in Mallarmé's poetry, the words themselves, they are the primary material, or they are materials of primary importance, and not the author behind the words. To write is through a prerequisite impersonality, not at all to be confused with the castrating objectivity of the realist novelist. Impersonality, but not of the type of the realist novelist, the kind of realism that Lukács talks about. The novelist apparently objectively looks at the world and describes this world, but that is not impersonality. But the new idea, Mallarmé's idea, was prerequisite impersonality to reach that point where only language acts, performs, and not me. So the idea of language performing itself by itself. So language appears to become some kind of self-generating dynamo. In a sense it is true, because as you know that poetry is always a struggle with language, because language always tries to impose upon everybody particular structures. Those who studied Chomskyan linguistics would know. Chomsky talks about deep structure in language. The task of the poet is to go beyond this structure and take hold of the words and use them in their own way. So there is a great, very interesting book by David Leach, The Linguistic Study of Poetry. I am writing only the name of the author. The Linguistic Study of Poetry, where Leach says that in poetry we find parallelism and deviation. So the writer has to deviate from the common way of using language. So linguistic deviation is necessary in poetry, and also parallelism, creating certain patterns. To reach that point where only language acts, performs, and not me. So the subjectivity of the author is not important. Mallarmé's entire poetics consists in suppressing the author in the interest of writing, which is, as will be seen, to restore the place of the reader. So we have a different concept of writing. So writing begins where the author dies. So Mallarmé relinquishes his position as the sole person controlling writing. Rather, he behaves like a mediator, and the actual meaning he expects would be generated by the reader. So Valéry, encumbered by a psychology of the ego, considerably diluted Mallarmé's theory, but his taste for classicism, leading him to turn to the lessons of rhetoric, he never stopped calling into question and deriding the author. Paul Valéry, a great French poet and critic of the 20th century, Valéry loved classicism. This is very interesting. Most French authors, even modern French authors, they still are in some way influenced by 17th century French neoclassicism, and that movement made language and words extremely important. If you think of Racine's plays, in Racine's plays there is very little action, but the entire attention of the reader is on language, because whatever the poet achieves, he achieves through perfect use of words, perfect composition, meter, rhythm, and assonance, and all the richness, all the wealth that language can provide, we can see in Racine's plays. So we do not have any such comparable writer in English literature. And therefore the later French writers, they were extremely influenced by writers like Racine, and Valéry also still was influenced by classicism, and therefore in classicism the author is not that important as the language is. The sole attention turns from the author to the language, and you can imagine that this kind of classicism, we may call it neoclassicism if we like, it is diametrically opposite to romanticism, because in romanticism it is the subjectivity of the poet or the writer which is most important and tries to find expression in writing, but in classicism the subjectivity is more or less suppressed. So if you think of Pope and Dryden, like our English neoclassical writers, you will see that the emphasis on form, the emphasis on rhythm, meter, the emphasis on perfect expression in a suitable form, in a compact manner, that is the classical idea, which is diametrically opposite from romanticism, where form is less rigorous, but there is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. That is just the opposite of classicism. So the romantic English poets, they use the form ode. Ode is much more liberal, has much less rigor. So Valéry diluted Mallarmé's theory, but even then, since he had this classical influence on him, he derided the author or disregarded the position of the author. So you can see that Valéry is criticized by Barthes for being egoistic, which many poets are, but at the same time Barthes recognizes his value. He stressed the linguistic and, as it were, hazardous nature of his activity, and throughout his prose works he militated in favor of the essentially verbal condition of literature, in the face of which all recourse to the writer's interiority seemed to him pure superstition. I love this expression. The writer's interiority is pure superstition. So the importance of language, the importance of words, or in other words, the linguistic aspect of writing acquires a kind of predominance over any subjectivity of the writer. Now, if you think logically, like the way people thought beginning from Homer up to the 18th century, so the 19th century is an aberration. So if you think logically, like these thousands of years people have thought, that the subjectivity of an individual is not important. Why should it be important? Okay, but the tables were turned by the Romantics, and we are still reeling under that shock. So we still believe that being romantic is the best thing in the world. Okay. Okay, but some do believe that being a classicist is much better. I do not know much about contemporary English poetry, but in Bengali poetry, if you read Sudhindranath Datta, he was a classicist. So to properly appreciate Sudhindranath Datta, you have to first shed the influence of Rabindranath and other romantics. And the influence of Rabindranath is so overwhelming that it will take the Bengali race hundreds of years to overcome that influence. Okay, so but unless you can overcome that influence to some extent, you won't be able to appreciate the beautiful close-knit form of Sudhindranath's poems. So Valery thought that emphasizing on the linguistic aspect of writing is a hazardous activity. Why hazardous? Because hazardous also has the sense of accidental quality. So language has many pitfalls and accidents, and some of them are happy accidents, others are not. And the poets have to take every care to master language so that they can avoid the pitfalls and create the happy accidents. That is why it is a hazardous activity to deal with words. Words are more powerful than bombs. So when you are dealing with words, you are like a bomb disposal team. It is a hazardous activity. So Valery militated in favor of the verbal condition of literature. Why did he have to militate? Because the influence of Romanticism led even the French nation for a moment forget the essentially linguistic nature of writing. Now even today the French are masters of linguistics, and we study if we study French literature, we have to appreciate their literature linguistically. But they were not exempted from the pernicious influence of Romanticism. Think of Victor Hugo. So Victor Hugo wrote long inane poems like Rabindranath. I mean, many poems. So, well, what I mean is that when I was young, then not only me, some of my friends also, we always thought that there should be a compact selection of Rabindranath's poetry, leaving out the inane long stories which are there in the name of poems. For example, Dui Bigha Jomi. Okay, so there are many poems like Dui Bigha Jomi in Rabindranath's corpus, which he might not have written, but he wrote because, well, the addiction of versification. So that is how I will describe it. Once you learn how to versify, then you feel a tendency to always talk in verse and tell every story in verse. And there lies the great difference between poetry and verse. Okay, so for that I refer you to T.S. Eliot for the moment. Proust himself, despite the apparently psychological character of what are called his analysis, was visibly concerned with the task of inexorably blurring by an extreme subtilization the relation between the writer and his characters. A great example of 20th century French novel, the works of Proust. So he tried to distance himself from his characters through subtle use of language, subtilization. But if you have familiarity with Proust, you will know that the hero of his novel Marcel is the same, carries the name of his author Marcel Proust. Now, is Marcel Proust the hero of his own novel? So, Proust on the one hand gives his hero his own name, and thus he makes his task more difficult, the task of disengaging himself from the character, more difficult. Now you will ask me why, probably you will ask. So if you ask, then I will say that this was a challenge to the reader. So the first set of readers will be foolish readers. So they will immediately fall into the trap and say, yes, here is Marcel, he is Proust. He is no other than Proust. So Proust would require some kind of intelligence from his readers, who will find out later that Marcel is not Proust. So making his hero or giving his hero his own name, Proust is problematizing this whole issue and making the task difficult for the reader. The reader must understand that the hero is not Proust, not the author. By making of the narrator not he who has seen and felt, nor even he who is writing, but he who is going to write. So in Remembrance of Things Past, à la recherche du temps perdu, in that novel, Proust's hero, Marcel, wants to write a novel about his life. So Marcel is not the narrator, Marcel is not the author, but Marcel is one who wants to write the novel. And only after so many volumes of novel has been written, at the end of the novel, Marcel becomes ready to write the novel. Alright. So, you see how Proust avoided the trap into which Gide had fallen in Faux Monnayer. Gide made his task even more difficult by making the hero the author of his novel, which is impossible. Proust, however, did not do that. Proust made his hero one who wants to write the novel but cannot. But at the end of the novel, he is ready. So there are characters in this novel who are taken from reality, like Proust's friend Baron de Charlus, Count Robert de Montesquieu. On Proust's friend Montesquieu, the character Baron de Charlus is created. Alright, which often novelists do. So if you have a novelist friend, you have the risk that they might turn you into a character in their novels. However, with Proust it was different. In this case, Barthes says that life imitates writing, life imitates art, not art that imitates life. Proust gave modern writing its epic by a radical reversal. Instead of putting his life into his novel, as he so often maintained, he made of his very life a work for which his own book was the model. So that it is clear to us that Charlus does not imitate Montesquieu, but that Montesquieu, in his anecdotal historical reality, is no more than a secondary fragment derived from Charlus. So, for Proust, art becomes reality, and his life imitates his own art, so that the friend, as if the friend Montesquieu was only an aspect or an imitation of the character Charlus in his novel. Lastly, to go no further than this prehistory of modernity, surrealism, though unable to accord language a supreme place, language being system and the aim of the movement being romantically a direct subversion of codes, itself moreover illusory, a code cannot be destroyed, only played off, contributed to the desacralization of the image of the author by ceaselessly recommending the abrupt disappointment of expectations of meaning, the famous surrealist jolt. By entrusting the hand with the task of writing as quickly as possible, what the head itself is unaware of, automatic writing. By accepting the principle and the experience of several people writing together. So these are the experiments that surrealist writers or poets undertook. Automatic writing, where people let their hands scribble something, of course not when they are fully sober, when they have taken a lot of hashish and other things, drugs, and then they are ready to write. So their hands are ready to write, then they let their hands write. So whatever the hands write, the head does not know, like in Macbeth. Okay, so that is called automatic writing in surrealism. Otherwise, they also suggested collective writing, and then always giving a shock to the reader, a jolt to the reader, whether it is a surrealist poet or filmmaker or painter. Their purpose was to shock the bourgeois audience. So surrealists were almost like revolutionaries, but they didn't have any revolutionary program because they were themselves part of the bourgeois culture. However, they were able to give the complacent bourgeois audience a kind of jolt or shock. So Dadaism and Surrealism, these movements are famous for that. So Barthes says that these movements are the prehistory of modernity. That is, in these attempts by the Surrealists, one sees the overthrow or the rejection of the authority of the author. Because if you accept that the hand can write without the involvement of the author, then it is not something that is coming from any individual, that is coming from any author. So it is a kind of rejection of the author function. Now I cannot actually use the word author function here unless anachronistically, because Foucault developed the term author function later. So we should not use this term here. Leaving aside literature itself, such distinctions really becoming invalid, linguistics has recently provided the destruction of the author with a valuable analytical tool by showing that the whole of the enunciation is an empty process, functioning perfectly without there being any need for it to be filled with the person of the interlocutors. The linguistic concept of enunciation. So when we study linguistics, we see that there the speech is analyzed. Any speech is analyzed linguistically. But who is the speaker? That question is irrelevant to linguistics. Only the speech is relevant. So any expression, any formulation is an enunciation, a linguistic term, something which is formulated, expressed, is an enunciation. But who speaks it? Who is the speaker or who is the author? Linguistics does not take that into account, is not concerned with that. Linguistically, the author is never more than the instance writing, just as I is nothing other than the instance saying I. Language knows a subject, not a person. So even if we think of our traditional grammar, in grammar there is subject, object. So subject is a grammatical term, but there is no person, no individual. And this subject, empty outside of the very enunciation which defines it, suffices to make language hold together, suffices, that is to say, to exhaust it. So this subject is possible because of the enunciation, because the speech or the discourse is there. That is why one may say that what is the subject in this sentence. So it is the enunciation that makes the subject possible, and the subject is only a grammatical concept, only a counter to hold together the whole linguistic process. But Barth says that holding together the linguistic process is also exhausting it. Exhausting means that linguistics does not examine anything beyond that piece of writing or that piece of language. That exhausts the scope of linguistics. The removal of the author, one could talk here with Brecht of a veritable distancing, the author diminishing like a figurine at the far end of the literary stage, using a theatrical metaphor. As in Brecht's epic theatre, there is alienation or Verfremdungseffekt. The actor or the person or even the character in Brecht's play becomes more and more distant from the viewer. But what the viewer can see is the performance, not the person, not the character, because the viewer is not allowed to identify himself with the story, with the characters, in the illusion of the story. Therefore, the viewer sees only the performance. It is not merely an historical fact or an act of writing. So the author diminishing is not just a historical fact. It utterly transforms the modern text, or which is the same thing, the text is henceforth made and read in such a way that at all its levels the author is absent. The whole idea of a text is transformed. When we think of a text as the weaving of language, where the author is absent, the author is of no importance. So Barth says that the author recedes, leaving us the text. So text takes altogether a new meaning for us. The temporality is different. The author, when believed in, is always conceived of as the past of his own book. Book and author stand automatically on a single line divided into a before and after. So, temporality of a text. There is a timeline. The author comes first, then he produces a book. The book comes later. But that timeline disappears with the disappearance of the author. The author is thought to nourish the book, which is to say that he exists before it, thinks, suffers, lives for it, is in the same relation of antecedence to his work as a father to his child. So one may imagine that these are all metaphors. The author creates a work, nourishes a work like a father. I would say that Barth should have used the term mother. instead of father here. But even then, it is a metaphor. So, what is a metaphor? A metaphor is a lie, which means that it is not true. The author does not originate or nurture, he does not do any such thing. All these we imagine, but it is the text which gains in precedence over the author in post-romantic times. Now this phrase you will not see anywhere. I just coined it, so it is not a critical term. Don't mistake it to be a literary term, post-romantic. Right? So I do not know otherwise how to formulate this whole concept, because Romanticism upheld the author concept, worshipped the author as a genius, but the later developments of which Barthes is talking, surrealism, and as you gradually move on towards linguistics, structuralism, post-structuralism and postmodernism, all these things happen after Romanticism, and they turn the tables once again. So the Romantics turned the table against the Classicists, and these later movements, they turned the table against the Romantics. In complete contrast, the modern scripture is born simultaneously with the text. So Barthes uses the word modern, I use the word post-romantic. So you have to understand what is modern, which means that if if we accept the term modern as something after the Romantics, then we also accept that the Romantics were not moderns. That is a corollary. So modernism comes after Romanticism. The modern scripture is born simultaneously with the text. So Barthes uses a new term, scriptor, and not writer or author. So who is a scriptor? In this term we have the word script. The script is writing, essentially without the voice. The author, the term author suggests voice, presence. The term writer, it also suggests somebody who writes, that is an agency of a person. Scriptor, well, even a machine can, script things. If you just program in a computer, then things can be written by a machine. Okay. So scriptor is not a writer or an author. So the scriptor is born with the text. So Barthes says that in modern times the new concept of text is born. A new concept of text and a new concept of scriptor. But birth also means here that the birth of the scripture is simultaneously with the text, whereas in case of the author was before the text. There was this timeline, the author was in the past, then he would create his work, the work came later. But in this modern concept, Barthes says that the text and the scripture, they rise simultaneously. Is in no way equipped with a being preceding or exceeding the writing, is not the subject with the book as predicate. The subject predicate, traditional grammar. So the scripture is not a subject and the book is not a predicate. The scripture and the book, they come together. There is no other time than that of the enunciation, and every text is eternally written here and now. So this concept of enunciation is taken from linguistics. So when a linguist approaches any piece of writing, he does not examine who wrote it, when did he write it. So I am talking about a modern linguist, not a philologist who looks at language historically. So a philologist would say, well, the word that you just used, that was used by the Indo-Iranians in 4000 BC. So that is the task of a philologist. So I told you about these two approaches to language, diachronical and synchronical. So modern linguistics looks at language synchronically, here and now. The fact is that writing can no longer designate an operation of recording, notation, representation, depiction, as the classics would say. So recording, representation, depiction, these terms would suggest that these are done by somebody, done by an author. So in classics, by classics here, Barth means past literature as opposed to modern literature. So in past literature, these terms are used, recording, representation and so on. Rather, it designates exactly what linguists referring to Oxford philosophy call a performative, a rare verbal form exclusively given in the first person and in the present tense, in which the enunciation has no other content than the act by which it is uttered. So here Barth is referring to the theory of speech act or performative theory by the Oxford linguist J.L. Austin. So Austin said that there are certain linguistic expressions which are performative. As kings would say, I declare, or ancient poets said, I sing. So these are enunciations made then and there. So as today VIPs would come and inaugurate something, or say somebody declares the Olympics open, you invite the Emperor of Japan to declare the Tokyo Olympics, I declare the Olympics open. So this kind of statement, these are these enunciations, these are, according to Austin, speech acts, which means that this speech does not refer to any outside meaning, it refers to this act of speaking itself. Similarly, ancient poets saying, I sing. So of course they sing. I mean, that is why one would open the book of an epic poem to see how the poet sang his song. So why do they have to add I sing? So that does not have any other meaning apart from this declaration that I begin my poetry here, I begin my epic poem here. So Austin theorized that this was speech act. Let me look at Sneha's question. Validate himself as a writer by increasing the difficulty level. Yes, of course, Sneha, I think you are right. But whether on deathbed or not, I mean, he wrote the novel for many years, and it was the conceptualization of the novel as a work of art which precedes or becomes prior or more important to life itself, lived his work. If we look at his life, which is a very regressive thing to do, to look at the biography of a writer, but nevertheless if we make an exception and look at Proust's life, then we will see that he lived his novel and he rarely came out of it. So he would keep his doors and windows closed throughout the day and night. Only in the middle of the night he would come out and some cafe would be open and he would meet a few friends, and then again he would go back to his room, which would be all shuttered, completely closed from the outside world. So he lived his art, he lived his novel. With him it is the other way around. The novel did not imitate his life, but he imitated his novel, one will say. Thank you for the comment. Having buried the author, the modern scripter can thus no longer believe, as according to the pathetic view of his predecessors, that this hand is too slow for his thought or passion, and that consequently, making a law of necessity, he must emphasize this delay and indefinitely polish his form. So Barthes says that, well, he is using the example of J.L. Austin. For that matter, he is borrowing largely concepts from linguistics. He is using the example of Austin's speech act theory to establish that today a text is a linguistic enunciation, and the text has a scripter and not a writer, and unlike the author who believed that his hand is very slow and therefore it takes a lot of time to write it, the scripter is born simultaneously with the text, and there is nothing slow about it. So the whole process of enunciation takes place there and there, here and now. So this traditional idea that an author polishes his work over a long period of time. Writing takes a lot of time, the author polishes his work over a long period of time. That idea becomes irrelevant in this modern context because the author concept itself is rejected. Therefore, in whichever state a piece of writing is available, that is the finished piece of writing. So no chronology is accepted from a linguistic point of view. Right. So you are probably thinking, why not? It is true that writers take time to write things or not. It is true for a historian or a biographer. A biographer will note down how many days, how many years an author required to write a particular work, but not a linguist. A linguist will judge, will analyze the work as it is, in the exact state in which he finds it. Therefore, a linguist does not think of any author. So, the idea of the scripter is, it does not refer to any individual or person. It refers to a function. The function of a text being scripted. And the text is scripted here and now, and the linguist analyzes it as he finds it in his hand. In the exact condition, he finds it in his hand, and he does not consider any chronology, any history. For him, on the contrary, the hand cut off from any voice, born by a pure gesture of inscription and not of expression, traces a field without origin, or which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. For the scripter, The scripter receives only the script, only the pure, only the piece of writing. So he does not look at the hand, or he does not look at the author or any voice. And therefore, this writing may be said to be a pure gesture of inscription and not expression. So expression always suggests an artist, an author behind it. But inscription does not suggest any origin, anybody behind the work. So Barth here makes use of two concepts, field and origin. The concept of field is widely used in social sciences, in anthropology, and field refers to the domain of a particular work. Origin is taken from metaphysics. So metaphysics deals with origin, the question of origin, whether it is the origin of the universe or whether it is the origin of any work. Whenever we talk about origin, we are taking a metaphysical point of view. So in the modern concept of writing, Barth says the field is only there, the origin is not sought after, the origin is not being inquired into. So the scripture traces a field without origin, and it has no other origin than language itself. Now language ceaselessly calls into question all origins, which means that the modern study of linguistics it avoids any metaphysical interpretation of language. So linguistics studies language as an event, whether a written event or a spoken event, as an event, but not as something historically rendered. So language does not believe in any origin, because it is not possible. If somebody tries to trace the origin of language, it is never possible to trace it. Therefore, modern linguistics has refrained from looking at language historically, but it looks at language synchronically, here and now. We know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. So you see how here Brecht is introducing the idea of intertextuality. So he says that a text is not a product of an author who is the creator or who is the origin. So if we believe that an author is the origin of a text, then that is like theology, because in theology it is believed that God is the origin of this universe. So in modern writing, Barth says there is no author God and there is no origin. Therefore, here, if there is no origin, then there is no timeline. So instead of temporality, it is the spatiality which becomes important in this case. So multidimensional space in which a variety of writings blend, none of them original. Why? Because it is impossible to trace the origin of language. If you believe that there is an origin of language, then you believe in the Bible. The Word became God, or God became Word. So that is theology. That is not linguistics. So linguists try to look at language as scientifically as possible, and it is not possible scientifically to trace the origin of any language. Therefore, no enunciation can be original. No text can be original. All texts borrow from other texts. All speech borrows from other speeches. So where does that leave you? You cannot say anything new. Whatever you say, somebody has already said it, or you are only repeating something. But actually that is how language works. Children learn language by imitating their parents. So originally, if you notice, a child does not say anything new. A child only mimics what others say. That is how language develops. And when a child has in his or her memory a lot of expressions, then from that store of memory or store of expressions, he or she makes new sentences, which we believe to be new, but they are not new. They are just fashioned out of all the store that we have in our memory, all the store of linguistic expressions. So therefore here comes the concept of intertextuality. All texts are blends of other texts. And this essay itself is a great example of intertextuality. You see how many other writers the essay evokes or refers to, their ideas, their expressions. The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture. So it is always, we may say, theoretically, a number of quotations taken from other writers, other people. Walter Benjamin had a famous project. He wanted to write a book which would be made only of quotations. So, quotations become very important in modern theoretical approach to writing because quotations they accept the fact that nothing new can be said. So a text is a tissue of quotations drawn up from innumerable centers of culture. Similar to Beauvoir and Pécuchet, those eternal copyists, at once sublime and comic, in whose profound ridiculousness indicates precisely the truth of writing. Barthes referring to or alluding to Flaubert's novel Beauvoir and Pécuchet, the last novel by Flaubert, where these two characters, well, they decide to write books on every subject by copying and pasting all statements which can be found in a book on a subject in various books. So just by bringing together statements of others and copying and pasting them, they wanted to write a book or kind of an encyclopedia. So Flaubert's intention in this novel was to suggest the futility of the attempt to write something original or something new. Writing ultimately is always a kind of borrowing. Can we use that while explaining this one? Which one, Sneha? Which one can we use?
So when you were explaining that how nothing can be new, it is all a repetition but in a different form. So I thought when we were reading the poetics, this thing came up that everything is shadow of a shadow and it is twice removed from reality. It is merely imitation. So is this the same thing, sir?
No, no, it is not the same thing. I am glad that you raised this question. Barth is not thinking here about the imitation theory, whether it is the Platonic imitation theory you are talking about, that the world is a reflection of idea in God's mind, and writing or literature is a reflection of that world, therefore it is twice removed from reality. But that is not the issue here. The issue here is that language cannot be studied with reference to its origin, or for that matter, for modern philosophical, most modern philosophy, the idea of origin has been problematized and often rejected. The idea of origin is it can be found in Aristotle's metaphysics. So this idea of origin is intimately related to theology, because when we believe that God is the creator of this universe, we believe in origin in terms of theology. Philosophically speaking, Aristotle won't mention God, but would mention the prime mover or some such other concept. And the concept of anybody prior to this world and creating this world or controlling this world, this concept kind of found expression in Hegel, but post-Hegel, gradually Nietzsche and other philosophers abandoned this concept of source or origin. And in linguistic philosophy, Wittgenstein also took an approach of looking at language as ordinary language, which contains whatever truth we have at our disposal. There is nothing beyond that, nothing beyond ordinary. So Wittgenstein talks about ordinary language philosophy. So the notion of finding a source and origin behind the work or behind the world, that notion has now philosophically been rejected post Enlightenment. And that is why modern linguistics has become possible. Linguistics looks at language as a given body of text, and it does not inquire into any source. So Barth is talking here about this Flaubert's novel Mover and Pecuche as an example, and even though it appears to be ridiculous, it generates a lot of humor. These two famous copyists, they appear to be ridiculous, that they think that a new work can be written only by copying. But if we accept this modern linguistic point of view, then this is not ridiculous. This is actually the situation in which we find ourselves, that all linguistic constructs, they are intertextual. They are always, they contain copies of other things. So everything is a copy and nothing is original. Now this concept, of course, will be taken to its extreme by Baudrillard, which we will read next. So Baudrillard would talk about the fact that we have reached a state where copies are only true in the digital age. So nothing is original. There is no original. Only copies are true. Okay, so that is hyper reality and so on. So we will go there later. But here Barthes says that in modernism itself, in modern linguistics itself, we find that a text is a tissue of quotations. Nothing is original here. So this is in consonance with modern philosophy, post-Enlightenment philosophy. You think of Nietzsche, you think of Heidegger, where the question of origin, the question of metaphysical presence of God, these questions are, these ideas are rejected. So Buber and Pécuchet, at once sublime and comic, and whose profound ridiculousness indicates precisely the truth of writing. The writer can only imitate a gesture that is always anterior, never original. Imitates a gesture which was already there, anterior. So you can imitate something if there is something there to imitate in the first place. So writing is always imitating something which is already there. But this idea of imitation is very different from Platonic, Aristotelian or Renaissance idea of imitation. This is a completely linguistic approach where language is mostly imitating. His only power is to mix writings, to counter the ones with the others in such a way as never to rest on any one of them. Did he wish to express himself, he ought at least to know that the inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary, its words only explainable through other words. So, the idea that an author originates a text, the romantic idea, let us think of that. The author originates a text. So, where does he find his text? He finds all linguistic expressions in his memory. And these linguistic expressions stored in his memory are nothing but imitations of different linguistic expressions that he heard before. Alright. Therefore, the inner thing which the author thinks that he is expressing his subjectivity, this inner thing is nothing but a compilation of quotations, speeches of others which he heard before. That remains in his memory, from which he is drawing when he is trying to express anything new. So it is a ready-formed dictionary. Its words only explainable through other words, and so on indefinitely. Here we find the linguistic, Saussurean linguistic concept that words can be explained only by other words, and those can be explained by other words. So it is like a chain of expressions, but ultimately you do not find any final meaning of any word. You get words in place of words. That is why Hamlet said words, words, words. So you can replace words with words, but you falsely believe that there is some meaning. So whenever you try to look for meaning, meaning is not there. Okay. The moment you have decided that there is no God, that there is no ultimate reference point, there is no meaning. So we have only expressions, and expressions can be explained by other expressions. something experienced in exemplary fashion by the young Thomas de Quincey. He was so good at Greek that in order to translate absolutely modern ideas and images into that dead language, he had, so Baudelaire tells us in Paradis Artificiel, created for himself an unfailing dictionary, vastly more extensive and complex than those resulting from the ordinary patience of pure literary themes. A very interesting intertextuality here, you see. Barthes is referring to a concept which he got from Baudelaire. Baudelaire is talking about Thomas de Quincey. Thomas de Quincey was so good in Greek that he decided to compile a Greek dictionary which can give expression to our modern feelings. Well, I tried to find the source of this statement, but I didn't. I didn't find anything in Thomas de Quincey that he wrote or tried to write a compilation of Greek words. So who knows whether Baudelaire created this fiction or not in Paradis Artificiel, but it serves Barthes' purpose here. So let us assume that de Quincey actually tried to compile such a Greek dictionary. Now the whole project is very interesting and hypothetical. Greek is a dead language, so ancient Greek. So how can one express modern sentiments, modern emotions and modern feelings with a dead language? So in itself it is an impossible task, but it provides Barthes with a perfect example of creating something out of old expressions. So where would de Quincey find such ancient Greek words? You would find them in the ancient Greek authors, because a language which is dead, you cannot invent a new word in that language, which means that the entire compilation of that Greek dictionary would be made from past writers, their expressions, their words, and the attempt to write anything in that language would be a writing out of the writings of past authors. So this is the perfect example Barthes gives here, which kind of supports or favors the argument that all linguistic expressions are imitations or pastiche made of fragments of expressions from the past. Is it clear? So de Quincey thought that this work created out of these Greek expressions would be vastly superior, vastly more extensive and complex than those resulting from the ordinary patience of purely literary themes. Succeeding the author, the scripter no longer bears within him passions, humors, feelings, impressions, but rather this immense dictionary from which it draws a writing that we can know no halt, that can know no halt. So the scripter does not represent a subjectivity. The scripter is not an author. Therefore the scripter does not know any emotions or passions. But it takes recourse to this vast store of linguistic expressions, and therefore can go on writing without any halt, without stopping. Why? Because the store of linguistic expressions is already infinite. Therefore, if you just take your expressions from the store, then you can go on writing without stopping. Life never does more than imitate the book. So this is the example. So let us imagine that all linguistic expressions known to us are compiled in a book, like De Quincey imagined, as Baudelaire reports. He wanted to compile all linguistic expressions of ancient Greek writers in a book. And then if you try to write anything out of that expression, then are you imitating life? No. You are imitating a book. But if you are alive, then life is imitating a book. And the book itself is only a tissue of science, an imitation that is lost, infinitely deferred. This is the Saussurean linguistics, that words are science and their meaning can never be final. Their meaning is always deferred, because of which Derrida spoke of difference, difference as well as deferral. Therefore, one cannot expect any final meaning in any book. So this is the concept of the new kind of criticism, where the critic would not try to analyze and summarize the meaning of a work. The meaning of the work would always be incomplete. And the book would always be open-ended. Therefore, from modern linguistic point of view, authors also have come to think of writing as open-ended. Work at progress. Samuel Beckett wrote something like that, work at progress. So, finality of a work cannot be imagined today. Once the author is removed, the claim to decipher a text becomes quite futile. So, the author is the container of meaning. A text can have a meaning if there is an author, just as the world can have meaning if there is God. You take away this central reference point and the work or the world loses its meaning. So in a situation where the author is removed, it is difficult to find any meaning. It is futile to decipher. To give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. So, if we imagine that a text has an author, then it will be a close-ended text, not an open-ended text. It will have a final meaning, which goes against the principle of modern linguistics, of Saussurean linguistics, that there is no final meaning. Such a conception suits criticism very well. The latter then allotting itself the important task of discovering the author. So here Barthes is ridiculing criticism. Well, so today we have theory. Theory has taken the place of criticism. And Barthes is writing from the point of view of theory, from the privileged position of theory, that how traditional criticism was limited, because criticism was very happy as long as the author concept was there. So the critic had a task of finding out the author, discovering the author and discovering the author's meaning. Such a conception suits criticism very well. The latter then allotting itself the important task of discovering the author, or its hypostasis, society, history, psyche, liberty, beneath the work. Hypostasis means underlying reality. So, if you believe in author who gives meaning to the text, then you also believe in society, history, psyche, liberty. These are all nodes of meaning. In the absence of any other term, I am using the word node, N-O-D-E, psyche, liberty, society. So you can write a social interpretation of a text, historical interpretation, psychoanalytical interpretation, and political interpretation, and so on. So these are the counters which hold meaning, and these are the traditional kinds of interpretation of a text which are possible by criticism. So as long as there is author, there is also the critic, and the critic's task is to discover the author and what social, historical, psychoanalytical, political meaning can be given to his text. But when the author is not there, then all these counters also vanish. So what we are left with is a piece of text which is a tissue of quotations, which can be analyzed only linguistically. And that is why in structuralist analysis of literary texts, we find that the writers, the analysts, they do not try to talk about meaning of the text. They talk about structure of the text, which means that structuralist analysis, linguistic analysis is a rejection of the traditional system of interpretation that is value oriented, meaning oriented. When the author has been found, the text is explained. So explained within single quotation marks. Explained means what? That the critic has found the author's meaning. So it has been explained. But this is what precisely structuralists do not do. They do not explain texts, but they analyze them. Victory to the critic. So the critic has finally found the meaning of the author. So he is victorious. Hence, there is no surprise in the fact that historically the reign of the author has also been that of the critic, nor again in the fact that criticism, be it new, is today undermined along with the author. So all kinds of criticism believes in this metaphysical author, and also in the function or value of the critic who discovers the meaning of the author and explains the meaning of a text. Even new criticism. That is why within bracket he writes, let it be new. So criticism, old or new, all criticism believes that a text can be explained. In the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be everything is to be disentangled, nothing deciphered. So according to modern linguistic point of view, there is only a multiplicity of texts. There is no author. And these multiple texts, they cannot be deciphered, because deciphering means you are trying to discover the meaning. So a cipher is a symbol. You decipher and you find the meaning hidden under the symbol. So Barth says that from a linguistic point of view, you cannot decipher a text. You can only disentangle it. So why disentangle? Here comes the metaphor of text as a weaving, like a piece of fabric of cloth, the waterproof of the text. So you can disentangle the threads. You can see the underlying structure, the bare structure behind the facade. So that is the task of the linguistic critic. The structure can be followed, run like the thread of a stocking at every point and at every level, but there is nothing beneath. So this beneath is another metaphor, that there is a meaning beneath the text. So there is a surface level and there is a lower level. The meaning is hidden. So this is essentially a kind of allegorical interpretation, which in the Middle Ages they always believed in God. So unless there is God hidden somewhere, there cannot be meaning hidden underneath. Okay. So Barthes does not use the word allegory, but he is just talking about this traditional metaphor of something lying beneath the surface level, which needs to be discovered. The space of writing is to be ranged over, not pierced. To pierce something is to dig. It is a vertical movement, diachronic, the diachronic axis of linguistics. To range over refers to the horizontal movement, the spatial movement, not the temporal, which is the vertical. Writing ceaselessly posits meaning, ceaselessly to evaporate it, carrying out a systematic exemption of meaning. So according to Saussurean linguistics, words continuously generate meaning, but the meaning also evaporates, because a signifier changes its signified with changing with different context, different usage, different speaker. So as the signified changes, so the meaning of a text would also keep changing. In precisely this way, literature, it would be better from now on to say writing, by refusing to assign a secret and ultimate meaning to the text and to the world as text, liberates what may be called an anti-theological activity, an activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse to fix meaning is in the end to refuse God and his hypostasis, reason, science, law. So the intellectual movement from the post-intellectual movement, the post-enlightenment intellectual movement leads towards modern linguistics, structuralism, post-structuralism and postmodernism. So this movement attempts to reject the previous theological approach towards the world as well as towards the text. So the belief that there is a secret meaning, or the belief that there is an ultimate or final meaning, this belief is essentially theological. So once we have rejected the theological interpretation of the world, we also move beyond literary criticism of texts which may have final beginnings. So we entered the realm of modern linguistics, where there is a chain of signifiers that generate meaning but also keeps changing their meaning. The signified keeps changing. Therefore, in such a scenario, meanings of words can also not be final. The meanings of words would also keep changing. And Barth says that it is better now to speak of writing rather than of literature, because literature is a term commonly used for many centuries, which has become associated with the author-centered interpretation. But if we talk of writing rather than literature, then we may imagine that writing is endless generation of signifiers that generate meaning, but they change their signified, and this process continues. The final meaning is always different. Okay, so it is very clear that Barth is writing from post-Saussurean linguistic point of view, behind which there is the post-Enlightenment philosophy that rejected theology, that rejected God, that rejected even rationality, the extreme importance given to reason in the Enlightenment, in empiricism, in French rationalism, that is now overturned by modern nihilism and philosophy of Nietzsche and Heidegger and so on. So in this context, from the modern linguistic point of view, literary criticism also needs an overhaul. And this essay by Barth boldly proclaims for the first time that the author must be declared to be dead. So what Nietzsche did in philosophy by declaring that God is dead, Barth does that here in literary criticism by declaring the death of the author.